Welcome, welcome, welcome. National Council for Black Studies is quite pleased and honored to have speaking with us today Congresswoman Karen Bass. And to introduce her, we have Dr. David Horn, who is a professor at CSUN, which I now know to be California State, Northridge. Some of us who are not here don't know the lingo. I was like, CSUN, see what? And so I bring to you Dr. David Horn, who will introduce our speaker today.
Congresswoman Karen Bass is what we call a people's representative. And in Los Angeles, we know what that means. Not only did she come out of a community-based organization, she became the first and only African-American female who was the Speaker of the California Assembly, which means she was in charge of it. A people's representative means that you know that a public servant has to serve the public. And that your job is to get as much legislation passed as you can that will help the community. That has been Congresswoman Bass's life. If there's one certainty that we always have, when we want to find out what our elected officials are doing, just check with her. She's the model that everybody else has to be measured by. We know when she goes to Congress, there will be legislation introduced. We know there will be legislation passed. The woman gets stuff done. Now, what we need to do is go back to 1972 when we first said we need more black elected representatives. Well, she's the kind of representative we were talking about. A lot of these other people just happen to be black, and they've been elected. And they forget who their constituents are. Karen Bass has never forgotten that, nor will she ever forget that. She is right now the ranking member of the House of Representatives on the Africa Subcommittee. That means as soon as the Democrats retake the House, she becomes the chairperson. She's the #1 advocate for African help and development, not more African aid. We are talking about Africa developing the way it should develop. She is advocating AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, which you all need to know about, but more importantly, she's advocating a strong Africa. She is where we go to make sure we are moving forward. I present Congresswoman Karen Bass.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. I appreciate that very much, and it's an honor to meet the president of the Black Studies Association. And I have to tell you, Dr. Horn, the highest compliment you could give me is to say that I'm a people's representative. There's nothing higher than that. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. It's really an honor to talk to you today and to be here, and also to see so many young people here. This is just a real testament to the work that's being done by the leadership and the work that's being done by my generation in preparing the next generation to lead in this area. So to me, Black Studies departments represent one of the victories of a long struggle that didn't start with the Civil Rights Movement, but most notably. And when I came on the scene, thank you, it was the struggle for power, black power, African-American power, a struggle that continues today, although the character of our struggle today is the fight to preserve what we've won, unfortunately, and to continue to fight of a couple of hundred years, frankly, that was once played out fighting against the shackles in the field, and today centers on fighting against the shackles in the penitentiary. When I think about why you asked me to come here today to talk about Africa, in my opinion, we have the same struggle as our African brothers and sisters. It's just being played out on a different continent. Same struggle, different land. When I was an activist in the 70s, it was a fight against apartheid, the fight against colonialism. Our struggle was supporting the liberation struggles and fighting against the policies of our own government. So needless to say, it's interesting to me to be a part of the government and to be in Washington, D.C. and to be a part of Congress. The policies of our own government that supported apartheid and provided weapons and financial support to the puppets of apartheid who attempted to dial back the hands of time after the battle was won. So fast forward a couple of decades, and I find myself as a member of Congress. And the first thing I wanted to do was to get on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And the Foreign Affairs Committee is divided by regions of the world. And I, of course, wanted to be on the Africa subcommittee. And I do have to tell you, though, that I call it the subcommittee on, because it's got a whole bunch of names. Global health, human rights, international organizations, and oh, by the way, Africa. And it's my job to make Africa front and center. Right. And so I don't just work in the committee structure, but I try to do a lot of things outside of the committee, frankly, to raise the profile of Africa. One thing that's fascinating in all of the madness that you hear about Congress, Africa is actually a bipartisan issue. It's fascinating to me that my Republican colleagues don't necessarily support African Americans, but you know, they do. They actually are very supportive when it comes to African issues. But, you know, I also found the old paradigm, the one that you see on late night TV, which is Africa as a charity case. You know, you see the starving babies, you know, on late night TV. It drives me crazy because, you know, one of the things, and this is true of many members of Congress, and it's also true of the general public, we just have no idea, number one, how big Africa is. We think Africa's a country, and my joke is that we think it's a country the size of Texas. We see it as a dysfunctional country filled with disease and in perpetual conflict. The idea that you're talking about over 50 countries on a continent, I always tell people that you could take the 48 states 3 times. And if you Google, I don't know if you've seen that website, Countries and Continents Inside of Africa, and you see how almost the whole world fits inside of the continent of Africa. It's always really important to see that and to view that and to teach that and to talk about that when you're talking about Africa, because even when you're talking about conflict, the majority of the continent is peaceful. The majority of the continent is not in conflict. But again, that is our view. But I do have to tell you that how does the rest of the world see this great land of our ancestors? The rest of the world is not subject to the bleeding heart, maternalistic, paternalistic view of the continent. China, India, Brazil understand that Africa is a land of great wealth and opportunity. And they, you know, I mean, if you think about the wealth, pick up your cell phones, you're talking about the wealth of Africa because you're talking about minerals that come from Africa. China, everybody knows, and everybody in the world is concerned about China's involvement in Africa. And we all are concerned about that. But on the other hand, you talk to the Africans and they were like, well, you know, I mean, the Chinese are coming over here and they have big checks, a lot of money. And in some countries, because a lot of countries have different policies, not every country has the same policy in regard to China. I was in the DRC for actually 2 days, and I remember you know, being in the Congo and driving from the airport to the U.S. Embassy, and it took us about 2 hours, which was about a 20-minute ride. And you know, you see just thousands of people walking. It's like, where are they going? One person working. Chinese, because the Chinese in some countries bring their workforce. And we complain here in South LA on Crenshaw about who's building the Crenshaw line, and we're worried that people from Orange County is building the Crenshaw line. Can you imagine what Africans feel like seeing a workforce from an entirely different part of the world, and they're not even able to have those jobs? So, you know, the Africans now are really pushing through the African Union the slogan of trade, not aid. And there's a lot to that. The point is, and when Dr. Horn was talking about development, you know, it's a different way to look at development. And it's a way of looking at development that was not necessarily used, that I was used to, or that I was even comfortable with. But, you know, the African countries are promoting business development and an equal partnership, and viewing the continent in a business-to-business relationship as opposed to a charitable relationship. And countries like China that have no real recent history of holding their own governments accountable when it comes to their own governments and also their own companies accountable when it comes to exploiting other lands. So I get to Congress, want to work on Africa, and find myself promoting U.S. business involvement on the continent of Africa, something I actually would have never imagined myself doing. And you know, and I thought about that, and one of the reasons why I do that, and obviously I don't mean U.S. business involvement in the continent of Africa run amok, but in our country we do have a history of struggling with our corporations, whether you're talking about Nestle or Gulf Oil or Conflict Minerals, even when it comes to the exploitation of the wildlife. We have the capacity to organize movements to hold our companies accountable. If you're looking at some of the other countries that are already there, they do not have that history, nor can I imagine the people in China rising up to hold Chinese companies accountable for doing business. So I find myself in the interesting position of promoting a trade agreement that I think what was a little controversial 15 years ago, AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and I'll describe that in a second. But to me, when I'm talking about promoting our businesses, I'm not just talking about promoting big multinational corporations, but I'm talking about promoting businesses, African American owned businesses. How do we do business with the continent of Africa? That winds up being a challenge on both sides. I have found a lot of African governments that want to do business with African American businesses, but our businesses have a big challenge. Not only do we have a challenge doing business here, but we have a huge challenge doing business in Africa, and I'll just describe a couple of the challenges. They're obvious and logistical. The ambassador to Gabon in West Africa very much wants African Americans to do business there. Well, it's very expensive to go to Gabon. So I've organized a number of meetings with African American owned businesses, and they basically need to know very specifically what are the contracts, what are the possibilities. I can't just invest $10,000 to go visit Gabon just to see what's happening over there, or make 3 or 4 trips, which then winds up putting you in the category of the multinationals, because it's difficult for our businesses to actually do that. One of the things I've learned in Congress is that there are actually several government entities that help U.S. businesses, whether you were talking about the Exim Bank or OPEC providing insurance. There are entities that help, but again, you kind of have to be to a certain size in order to qualify for that help. So some of those things we're trying to figure out how we get beyond. One area, though, is the African diaspora doing business on the continent of Africa. That, I think, has many more opportunities. I've been to Ethiopia several times, and there's a lot of Ethiopian Americans who've now gone home and are doing business in Ethiopia. And you find that in a lot of African countries. And so one of my goals and hopes is to really figure out how to organize our businesses to do business there, because there is a lot of opportunity, there's a lot to be made, and an awful lot to give. So AGOA is what is on the table now. The African Growth and Opportunity Act was passed about 15 years ago under the Clinton administration. It is the primary vehicle in which our country does business with the continent of Africa. It's far more political, in my opinion, than it is substantive, because basically what AGOA allows is it allows African businesses to export products to the United States without paying a tariff. Okay? The reality is, just like I talked about how U.S. businesses, African American owned businesses, have problems doing business in Africa, African businesses have problem doing business in the United States because they can't necessarily reach the volume that is needed to be useful here. So if you have a shop that is selling, baskets or clothes or whatever, and you want to do business here, you're talking about major companies like Macy's, and then having the capacity to produce the volume, that doesn't really work. So what happens is that you have businesses over in Africa that might sell to small shops here. But to reach the level of volume that it actually raises the standard of living for folks in Africa, that's what is very difficult. So the real reality is that AGOA is available to most of the countries on the continent, not all, but most of the countries, but very few countries actually take advantage of it. And truth be told, the major beneficiary of AGOA is the oil industry. In the U.S. is the major beneficiary. The auto industry is a beneficiary from South Africa. But what I have found in working with African leaders and African embassies is, regardless of that, it's what AGOA, it's the symbol of AGOA more than it is the substance of AGOA. So I go and I meet with the entire, in Washington, D.C., there is the African Union mission is there. And of course, all the African ambassadors are there. And they meet once a month. And I've gone to their meetings where all the ambassadors are there. And they're all pushing and fighting for AGOA. And 90% of them can't even take advantage of AGOA. So that's why, to me, it is more a political and a symbolism of an agreement between the United States and the continent of Africa that makes it so important. If AGOA expires and is due to expire at the end of September, if it does expire, one of the main industries aside from oil and gas that takes advantage of AGOA is the textile industry. If it is to expire, then you are talking about a couple 100,000 African women that will lose their jobs. And the reason why they will lose their jobs is because in the textile industry needs about 6 months to do their orders. So if you don't have it together, meaning the United States, and we don't extend it, they just say, forget Africa, let's go to Vietnam. Or let's go to Thailand, and they'll just move their orders over. So a couple of years ago, part of AGOA that relates to textiles was getting ready to expire, and we didn't have it together until the last minute. And probably about 30 or 40,000 African women lost their jobs. Well, then, I also raised the question, what does that textile mean? What are we talking about? What kind of jobs are we talking about? I mean, be real. We're talking about jobs that here would qualify as sweatshop jobs. And so then one has to grapple with that. But, the thing is, and I've actually gone over to countries and visited, the factories, and so I've seen, the working conditions, and of course the places I saw, the working conditions weren't horrible. They're not going to take me and show me working conditions that are horrible. We know that. But, on the other hand, it's a tough argument to say, forget that because it doesn't reach our standards, when you're talking about people who have no choice.
Right.
And the point is that you start with that, you allow people to organize, to fight for better working conditions, and that way, people are lifted up. Another program that I work with is the National Endowment for Democracy, which actually, this is U.S. government funds, but it funds the activism and organizing. Again, you can debate it in some areas as to what that really means, but they do work with the labor movement so that alongside of this, you have the capacity to provide resources to people to organize to raise their standard of living. So I want to just say a couple more comments and then open up. In terms of other issues that are really critical on the continent right now that I know everybody in here is very well aware of, and that is the number of elections that are getting ready to take place. You know that the election was postponed in Nigeria. Boko Haram was used as the reason. The election is going to take place shortly in the next few weeks. But there are about 15 elections happening around the continent this year alone. And that's really critical. And it's going to be a crossroads on the continent in terms of whether or not the presidents will allow elections to take place. And a couple of them, when our president had the African summit last year, we met with a number of the presidents, and a couple of them have some pretty interesting ways they plan to weasel their way around the elections. But I actually have a little different take on it, and maybe it's a controversial take, I don't really care, but I think we push elections, and I think elections are good things. But I worry that sometimes we push elections beyond the point of it making sense. And I'll give you an example. Liberia. Liberia is just coming off of, dealing with Ebola. And so we're going to push an election. And if they're not ready for that election, and if the leadership isn't there, one of the things that we have seen happen in a number of African countries, it's so hard for us to imagine the way an entire country can collapse. I mean, the Central African Republic, they had a coup. That country totally collapsed. Mali, I mean, you can go on and on and on. And so I worry that if our government pushes in a situation like Liberia versus a situation like the DRC or some of the other countries, but if we push, what are we actually doing? How is that really helpful? And so anyway, elections is a big thing that's happening. I was actually, got an email yesterday. I was invited to be a part of a presidential delegation next week to go to Namibia. Because Namibia is having an inauguration for its next president. Again, there's a number of countries in Africa that routinely have elections and routinely transfer power, and we never hear about it because the only time we hear about anything is when it's a disaster. But they're going to, swear in their next president next weekend, so I'll be honored for the first time for me to go to Namibia to participate in that. So elections is a key issue. Ebola, was huge. And I do have to tell you that, when the history books are written, it will be a source of tremendous pride for the Obama administration because he really took the leadership in the world around Ebola. And just 6 months ago, the CDC was predicting 1 million people would be infected with Ebola and would die. Well, the count right now, which is a horrible count, but it's 10,000. It's 10,000 versus 1 million. And obviously the epidemic is not stamped out, but it is under control, and they're actually shutting down some of the field hospitals and all. And then obviously the conflicts that are going on around the continent, which are just very, very disheartening, whether you're talking about Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, the mess in Libya, the way Libya has impacted, the rest of that whole region. So the conflicts that are going on is obviously another big issue on the continent. And then corruption is always talked about. And corruption kind of annoys me sometimes because we act like Africa is the only place where there's some corruption. But come visit me in Washington, okay? Ooh, we've just normalized some stuff, okay? You can go work for the military. You can be in the military and then 5 minutes later be a private contractor. I mean, in some other countries, we call that corruption. Anyway, corruption is obviously a problem, and it's a heartbreak to me. I mean, being in the Congo and knowing how wealthy the Congo is and knowing all the resources that are in some of these countries, and, it breaks my heart and I just don't understand how much money you can steal. I mean, it's like, okay, you're going to steal some money, go steal some money, but why do you have to take everything? That's the part that tears me up. But on the other hand, I do think that it's wrong to just see corruption in African countries and act like we don't have corruption here through and through. So anyway, I do want to ask for your help when it comes to AGOA. I started by saying that Africa is a bipartisan issue. Well, in a way, we suffer from that because it's bipartisan and because AGOA is not controversial. Democrats support it, Republicans support it, Labor's okay, business loves it, but we can't get it done because it's just not that urgent, because it's Africa and because it's not a crisis. So sometimes, and we're all experienced at this, if you need a crisis, well, get us a crisis. Then, we need to get people involved in contacting their representatives and saying that this is important. Congress is involved in so many issues that really, unless people are screaming and yelling about it, it just doesn't rise to the level of importance. But this is an easy one to do, and it expires at the end of September. I've been told by Republican leadership that they're going to get it done, in the next month or so. So I would just like to ask for your help. And with that, why don't I just end and open it up for questions and more important dialogue. Would you like me to just call on people? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
He had his hand up.
I'll let my open.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. It was really significant and important here. Here you have just two questions I want you to sort of react to. The first one is Zimbabwe and the sanction on the Zimbabwe government. I was one of the first Americans probably to live and work in Zimbabwe after the independence.
Wow.
I don't quite understand what our position is on Zimbabwe vis-a-vis what our position now seems to be on Cuba. Could you just speak to that for a while? And then the next issue is Sudan. Is it likely that we will have a hearing on the crisis, the racial crisis in Sudan, not South Sudan, the racial crisis in Sudan with the minority Arab population basically strangling the African population? Those are my two.
So, you know, our foreign policy is crazy. We know that. I mean, in terms of who we like on a given day and who we don't, and who we sanction and who we don't. You know, I was thrilled to see the president make the change on Cuba. I mean, in his response, because I've been to Cuba. I'm actually going again next month. But his response to our policy on Cuba was, well, we came up with that policy before I was born. And so it didn't make any sense. And so he changed it. But you know, I mean, why we have sanctions because we don't like Mugabe. We don't like Mugabe. One of the reasons is because he's been in power, you know, forever, and because of the human rights issues, you know, in Zimbabwe. That's our reason for the sanctions. And you know, Mugabe right now is the chair of the African Union. 91 years old and healthier than most of us in this room. You know, I was looking at Al Jazeera actually on TV yesterday, and they were covering Zimbabwe, and he was welcoming in the Chinese and Tommy, because he's basically just, okay, screw you guys. If you're gonna have sanctions against me, I'm going to where I can get it. And so he was inviting the Chinese, and they were doing ribbon cuttings, you know, all over. I can tell you that our policy is not getting ready to change anytime soon when it comes to Zimbabwe. And your question, could we do a hearing on the racial crisis in Sudan? See, what it means that Republicans control everything, it means they control everything. So I can make requests for hearings, but I can't do them. And I guarantee you that we would not have a hearing on that. You know, it is possible, though, to have some discussion. I was sharing with you earlier that the ambassador to Sudan came and met with me, and essentially, because they're getting ready to have elections, gee, who's going to win, in Sudan shortly, and wanting us to lift sanctions against Sudan, because we have sanctions against Sudan as well. And I know that's not going to change anytime soon.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you for blessing us, Congresswoman. One of my issues with AGOA is that in Africa, the Chinese are the ones who are benefiting the most regarding AGOA. They're setting up factories, and they are the ones that are benefiting. And you would think that it's the local indigenous people, but it's not. It's really the Chinese. And I want to know how the Congressional Black Caucus, of course, with your leadership on this subject, can bring monies to African American businesses to participate in AGOA, loan money, because we get lectured a lot about AGOA, but most of, as you said, we don't have the money to get involved with AGOA. The large, predominantly white corporations do so. And when we try to go to the banks, the African Development Bank, we're mostly turned down, just like the issue we had with the black farmers who will go to the Ag Bank and will be turned down. The next thing you know, there's a $1 billion lawsuit. And lastly, I want to know what this Congressional Black Caucus, and particularly your office, feels about the sanctions and what's about to happen in Venezuela. And would your office support a group of African American leaders going over to Venezuela in lieu of what the U.S. is doing regarding these sanctions, which many of us think that they're wrong? Thank you.
So in terms of who benefits from AGOA, you know, you are right, but it's not exclusively the Chinese, but you are right. When I was mentioning the textile companies, it can certainly be a textile company that's owned by the Chinese, you know, it can. But, you know, you can't deny the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of African women that work at that factory, too. You know what I mean? And so in terms of the loans and stuff, I do want to do a lot more advocacy in that regard. And I was describing earlier how I've tried to do that actually here in LA with African American businesses. I was working with architectural firms and construction companies. And so some of the loans could come from the Exim Bank. But there's, you know, there's always stuff on so many levels, right? You know, how many folks work in Exim Bank that focus on Africa? You know, and so trying to get those resources really within Exim Bank to have the staff that will pay attention to it. If you look at the staff of the Export-Import Bank, I'm sorry, I'm using it shorthand. If you look at the staff for that, you got, I mean, I'm making this up, but you might have like 5 people working on Africa and about 50 people working on Asia. But right now, the Republicans are so crazy, they're trying to close down the Exim Bank. I mean, it's due to expire in the next couple of months. So we're kind of fighting for it to stay alive because that is one of the primary funding sources. And then after we keep it alive, then advocate for them to focus on Africa and to make the loans. So fortunately, I don't think what you're asking is legislative, because that's where we really have problems. It's more advocacy. And so there is the advocacy within the Congressional Black Caucus to do this. And then you asked me about Venezuela, right? So just my own personal opinion about this, and you know, of course, I took major heat because I don't support the sanctions, and I don't support us doing what, you know, I feel. I mean, we don't like the guy in Maduro, you know, just like we didn't like Chavez, because he gets up in our face, and so, you know, that makes us mad. So I don't support them. But I know that people would be supportive of seeing folks, you know, go over there. There are probably the leader. I don't focus on that, but the person that does is Greg Meeks. He's the CBC member from. There's 3 African Americans on the Foreign Affairs Committee and about 40 or so on Foreign Affairs. He's the one that has been actively involved. He's been to Venezuela. He doesn't support sanctions. So when that came up in my committee, we were the only 2 people that voted against that. And then, of course, you know, we were harassed because of it. But I would think that you would check with his office about delegation. Then, you know, Danny Glover has been, you know, a major leader around Venezuela. It's been interesting. You know, while we were so busy over in Iraq, you know, South America was like, woo. I mean, you know, electing folks to office, and we didn't quite realize. We kind of woke up and went, wow, you know, what happened over there.
Yes, ma'am. You had your hand up in the back.
Okay, thank you, Congresswoman, for addressing us. I have a question for you. You mentioned, I thought was rather curious, that you address a number of African ambassadors in Washington regularly, and 9% of those ambassadors of those countries can't take advantage of AGOA. And so, tell me, what's the, why should we recommend the renewal of AGOA when 90% of Africans can't take advantage of it? You also mentioned that you had cleaned up some of the quirks that AGOA, disadvantaged about 5 years ago. I remember some of those problems were that AGOA benefited American businesses more than it benefited African businesses. So how is AGOA not just an aid deal? That was the criticism of Africans, back then when I studied that. But why, what's changed? Why should we renew AGOA when it doesn't really benefit Africans structurally?
The number one answer to that is because they really want us to. And the symbolism of us not renewing AGOA is a slap in their face. And so I think they view it, and I actually view it from the long term, which is we renew AGOA. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that needs to happen. For example, one of the reasons why a lot of African businesses can't take advantage of it is because they can't meet U.S. standards for a lot of things, safety, health, et cetera. And so part of what we want to do is provide the support, the technical assistance, so that they can reach the level. And I was saying they can't reach scale. If you're going to export, flowers or something, you got to export a whole bunch of them in order for it to be taken, seriously here. So I think that the African countries that can't take advantage of it want to see AGOA renewed because they see themselves as rising to the point where they can take advantage of it. And then just in terms of the political reality, I focus a lot more on how it benefits U.S. business, because I have to, in order for it to continue to be a bipartisan piece of legislation that's passed. The root of your question, though, isn't this another development program? In a way, yeah, it is. But, you know, I mean, it's one, now where the future should go, technically, is that, and this is an interesting question when it comes to South Africa, because some people want South Africa removed from AGOA because they feel that South Africa is a middle-class country, but all of us know that South Africa continues to have two economies, right? And so, the way things are supposed to go is a country reaches the level of development where they no longer need AGOA. So AGOA won't last forever. After you've raised your standard of living to a certain point, then we can enter into a normal trade agreement, which goes both ways. Right now, AGOA only goes one way. It only benefits countries that are exporting from Africa to the United States. Our companies, when we export to Africa, we have to pay tariffs. There's also, you know, when it comes to business and trade in Africa, there's so many problems. Internal to Africa, not having anything to do with outside of Africa. You have all sorts of border issues and customs and, you know, transportation issues. You know, for a lot of African countries, you got to fly to Europe to go to another African country, right? Because it's still about, you know, the colonialism. Railroads, you know, basic infrastructure that doesn't exist right now. So there's a lot of things that need to happen. But I think you would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater to just say, not renew it. But my number one answer to that is because the African countries are united. They want to see AGOA, and if we don't renew it, we are slapping them in the face. And not only are we slapping them in the face, it's the black president slapping them in the face, who brought them all over here last year, talking about all this stuff, and then can't even get this simple trade thing done.
Yes, we have your hand, and then, sir, I see you, and you.
I join my colleagues in thanking you so much for coming and giving us
Yes, my honor.
in-depth information. One of my concerns, and it's a long-term concerns, ever since whenever I have been fortunate enough to visit any African nation, is the issue of child labor and child labor exploitation. And I know that many times, that particularly in these poor families where perhaps their only source of income is their children and what they bring and so forth. And I was wondering to what extent, as a country who purports at least to care about the welfare of children, to what extent do we as a nation, politically or however, address that issue? Now, it is common to what happens in the United States, too, in terms of child exploitation and child labor and child sexual exploitation and what happens to young girls in various nations and so forth. So I was wondering to what extent is that part of some of the agenda in addressing some of the problems in various African nations?
Yeah, and I like the fact that you talked about here, because when you were talking about the girls, I was thinking about Western Avenue. And I was also thinking about the boys. But the other issue I work on domestically is child welfare, because it's our kids. And, you know, we got two systems for them. We got the child welfare system and the prison system, and pretty much they collide when a kid becomes a teenager. But, you know, I think that's a perfect example of how I think we do business a little different in our country. Because, you know, you have Starbucks that does a lot of business in Africa. You have the chocolate industry, where people over the years have put pressure on those industries against child labor. Now, some of it is because those industries see themselves, especially like a Starbucks, see themselves as socially responsible and all. But the only reason they see themselves or even pretend to be socially responsible is because of our history of movements of forcing that issue. And so, you know, to me, in the best of all worlds, if we get all these U.S. businesses, you know, involved in Africa, then to me the next step is that we organize the watchdogs to make sure that they're doing business properly. I do have to give you an example of one company, though, and that's General Electric. It's an interesting story with General Electric, because the African American executives and managers in General Electric organized. They have an affinity group. We'd call it a caucus. but they have an affinity group. And they got together and they pushed General Electric to get involved in Africa. And General Electric has done that. They're in, I think, over 20 countries. And they hire and train the workforce in Africa. Because, you know, there ain't a whole bunch of Americans going over. That's one of the other things. I know we're not going to export the workforce, okay? So, so they train. They've also created a lot of businesses, African-owned businesses. And then they invited me to this conference a few years ago. And I walk in the room, and there are like 300 African Americans there. They all do business with GE, doing business in Africa. And, you know, I mean, it's kind of, I still feel funny standing up here talking, doing a little commercial for GE. Hey, but it is what it is. and they're involved in energy, but they're also involved in healthcare. And I think it is an example of the fact, especially the way it was created. It was created by the African Americans that work for GE that, you know, push the company to do this. And so I do think that there are some standards. Now, having said that, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of U.S. businesses that have no standards and are not paying any attention to that at all. But, you know, we do at least have the capacity to pay attention to that area. I'll tell you, one of the big things I'm interested in, and I'm looking for U.S. companies. I haven't found any yet. But, again, the 2 days I spent in the Congo was just so upsetting. And the first thing I wanted to know was who did the contracts over this mining? What are the companies that have the contracts? And so, you know, there is this whole international transparency organization where, you know, mining contracts are supposed to, you know, but obviously a lot of these African leaders just, I mean, they took the trinkets, and it was probably a few $1 million. You know, when you're talking about tens of billions of dollars that's being pulled out. So I'm not letting go of the contracts because I want to know about the contracts, but I haven't found U.S. company yet that is really in some awful contract. Because again, we actually have a mechanism to prevent our companies from doing that. The other issue is conflict minerals. And see, that's an example of where we passed legislation where we were trying to solve a problem, but we created another problem. Because you know the way they get around the conflict minerals? Because you have to go through a process to sell them to the United States. The Chinese buy the minerals. And then they wound up coming back here and being put in your cell phone, and they bypassed the conflict mineral legislation. So it was good intention, but a lot of times when you pass legislation, it looks good on paper, but then when it's actually implemented, you have to go back and clean it up.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask two questions. One is regarding the State Department programs of exchange, both YALI and the current status of the YALI initiative, as well as the State Department programs for educational and cultural exchange. Having explored the options in the latter program, one of the inhibiting factors for us to participate in hosting young people who were coming as part of the exchange was the prohibition on the allocation of resources to host families. And we were being asked in our community to have host families support these young people for a month in their home. And many of the households, that was for people in the suburbs. I mean, you tell me you can't allocate the resources to the host families for that. It's prohibited as part of that contract.
I see.
But I'm interested in us being able to host those groups coming as part of the YALI,
Right.
particularly those of us that might be connected.
Where are you from, by the way?
I'm at the University of Massachusetts in Boston.
Oh, okay.
Second question is with regard to AFRICOM and your position with regard to the role of AFRICOM as it is currently being used in Africa and as I understand it, even the transference now of some of our, what was development assistance to AFRICOM to support whatever those activities might be. Interested in what is going on with AFRICOM.
Sure, me too, actually. I'm actually trying to go to do an AFRICOM tour. I'm one of the, and I think it'll probably be at the end of the year, I actually want to go and see what the U.S. military is doing. But I'll get to that in a second. You want to go with me? You know, I didn't know that about Yali. I didn't know about the host.
Through the State Department.
No, I got it in terms of not providing an allocation. I didn't know about that, so I'll follow up. The reason why I asked you where you were from is because they only went to a handful of cities. You know, they didn't come to Southern California. They were in Northern California, and they are supposed to come again this year. I think it might be August. So, Jacqueline, if you wouldn't mind, why don't we find out about that? Why they didn't allocate? Now, what I do know, Jacqueline Hamilton is a part of my staff that's here. You know, what I do know is what they did with Yali. It was the Young African Leaders Initiative that President Obama started. It's now called the Mandela Fellows. And, you know, the idea is, and you can imagine it's a tad controversial with African leaders because the U.S. embassies in every country recruited young people to apply, and they were selected by the U.S. Embassy and to be a part of Yali. And they come to the United States once a year, and then, you know, we also provide training and technical assistance for them. It was wonderful last year when the president hosted them, and he hosted the Yali young people the week before their heads of state came. So that in and of itself made a little statement. And you can imagine some of the heads of state are like, what you doing? Recruiting young people, the next generation of leadership. That's my son. He's the next generation of leadership. I mean, you know what I mean? So you can imagine it's a tad controversial. But what I did find is that the State Department essentially had a huge contract that they gave out to I'm assuming it's a for-profit business that does Yali. That's how that happened. So I'll find out whether or not there's any other resources that could potentially be there. AFRICOM, everybody knows what African Command, which is located in Stuttgart, Germany, you know. It's not located in the continent of Africa, and it's always been controversial as to whether or not it should be located on the continent of Africa. We have bases, you know, our major bases in Djibouti, but we have bases and troops, advisors in many different countries in Africa. And I will tell you, this is kind of like business for me. It's a very uncomfortable outfit to be wearing because, I mean, I spent my whole life being against the U.S. military involvement anywhere and everywhere, you know, and then I've been to a few places where it's like, oh, you have countries that are, you know, like Mali, for example. I went over to Mali for a minute. And, you know, in Mali, you had the French that were there because the Malian government didn't have the capacity. And the African Union didn't have the capacity either. I think the African Union is increasing its capacity, but one of the issues with the African Union is they always had a policy of non-intervention, even when there was chaos. Well, they've changed that policy, and now there's intervention in a lot of different places. To me, the way it should be is the African Union. And if we provide anything, we provide it to the African Union, and the Africans defend the Africans. But the reality is that the capacity isn't always there. And I mean, it was incredible that in Mali they had to call the colonial power back. But they were getting ready to completely fall. So, you know, that's a little bit of the conflict that I feel. I get a lot of people jam me over Boko Haram and say, why doesn't the U.S. go in and take care of Boko Haram? Well, Nigerians don't want the U.S. to come in, and they've been clear about that. So the U.S. is there with technical advisors and drones and a few other things, but, you know, in places where I've been where the African leadership has asked for the U.S. to come in, it's a little, you know, it's a little controversial. So you asked me what my position is, it's a little mixed. You know?
We have time for 2 more questions. You had your hand up, sir, and you had your hand up. Oh, and you had your hand up.
So, yeah, but we have to be quick because the Congresswoman has to go.
So, yes, sir.
Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon, Congresswoman. Thank you for your services as well.
Thank you for yours.
I'd like to meet you. My question is regarding AGOA, African Growth and Opportunities Act, and how it can help to stir and increase jobs here in America. Because I was listening to President Barack Obama recently, and he was noting that the employment has risen, and this lowest rate of unemployment is economic, being employed, leads directly to what Martin Luther King said, feeling good about yourself, and it's healthy, and being a part of the community and the society in which we live. Okay, I will, brother. I just want to invent this too. So can you?
But we are short on time.
I know. I just want to know. Can you please elaborate on it? Tell me your view and how American jobs, and when is your timetable as far as more jobs? Because I see the relation between my brethren in the prison is directly related to the lack of jobs here in this system. Thank you.
You want to take all the questions and I'll answer them all as at once?
Okay, so she's going to take all the questions and then answer them. You were
My
next.
question was about AGOA. You asked for help, or what can you do?
Thank you.
Okay, and you, sir.
And in regards to AGOA, just collaboration with regional economic communities on the continent.
Yeah, thank you.
To know a little bit about that, and also if the United States government actually takes, African economic integration seriously.
I think there was one in the back.
That was one. Was that one other hand? Okay, yes, sir.
My question, first of all, thank you. A couple of times I'm listening to you, and it's a privilege. My question is to know what can the Black Caucus do to educate all of us regarding these things we have been promoting in AGOA. I think part of it is because there is no knowledge of what is going on and what can be done. So what can the Black Caucus do to help? Educate us on that.
Okay, so I'll take all of these and wrap up. In terms of American jobs related to AGOA, a couple of industries, people who are employed at the Gap, people who are employed in the mall with clothes. That's again, clothes are made all over the world, but that's a relationship. The other relationship is the auto industry in a couple of states in the South. Where there's a direct relationship between, and I'm not good with autos, so I forget what it is, but there's some part of the engine. What is it?
BMW.
It's BMW?
Yeah.
Okay, where we import the part.
BMW has a plant in South Carolina, and there's also a BMW plant in South Carolina.
Okay, all right. So there is a direct, and it's actually, there's some U.S. Auto companies as well.
And General Motors has a subsidiary, I can't remember if it's Opel.
Okay, so there are directly related to the auto industry and South Africa, and it's actually one of the controversial parts. It's one of the reasons why people want to pull South Africa out. I argue for South Africa to continue. In addition to the fact that we have two economies in South Africa, it's South African leadership and the symbol, the role that South Africa plays within the region, to me, is why South Africa needs to stay in AGOA. So I can't sit here and tell you that these 40,000 jobs that black folks can get are directly related to AGOA. It's not the case. There are some jobs, and I would say textile and auto would be two of the main categories. In terms of people in prison and all, I'm just talking about Africa today, but the other big issue I work on is criminal justice reform. Because to me, all these issues are issues that directly involve our folks, whether we talk about our folks here or our folks in Africa. And so I work on foster care, I work on criminal justice reform, I work on African issues. So on another time, I would love to talk about criminal justice reform and specifically the issue around reentry. It's also the sex trafficking thing. To me, all of these things are interconnected. They're all interconnected. And then in terms of what you were asking, yes, people do very much take the regional integration very seriously. And as a matter of fact, I do want to mention two initiatives out of the Obama administration, though, that I didn't get to. And one of them is Power Africa. You know that 2/3 of the continent does not have electricity. And so the president has an initiative to involve a public-private partnership with some of our corporations and also some of our governmental institutions to bring electricity to Africa. And by the way, that is where some of our businesses are getting involved. So I went on a trade mission to Nigeria with our Commerce Secretary, and there were several African-American owned businesses that were a part of the trade mission, and they inked deals while they were there. Big deals, deals that they had been working on for years and they weren't able to break through. But because they walked off that plane with the Commerce Secretary, they were able to get their deals done. So, and that is, Power Africa is based on the regional economic community, and it's in East Africa. So the regionalization of the economies in Africa is so critical because, as you know, some of the countries are very, very small. And if you have a very, very small country, you're not going to ever be able to reach scale to do business with any of the major powers. But if you combine together and address some of these barriers that you have in between countries, you can reach scale. So the regional economic communities and African integration is absolutely taken very seriously. In terms of another initiative that I want to mention is food aid. This to me, I mean, I was just so pissed when I learned about what we do with food. I just didn't know. I mean, you know, I'm new. I mean, I'm only in my 5th year in Congress. But one of the things that we do is export food to Africa. Why on earth would we do that? And what that does is it destroys the local markets. But why do we do that? Because we have food we want to get rid of, because we're not going to feed people here. And also because we're keeping people employed in the shipping industry. So the president wanted to reform how we distribute food. We think we're doing all this charity work by sending food over, and that's not what we should be doing. We should be increasing the capacity of African farmers to do their own farming. Absolutely. You know? So I was up in the mountains in Kenya, and I was looking at a cabbage patch. And there were 2 patches. One was done with traditional farming, and the other one was done with scientific farming. Well, so the traditional farmer took the seeds for cabbage and just kind of, you know, spread them all over. Scientific farming, it's farmed in rows, and the rows are raised. Like anytime you drive in Central California, you always see that. We don't think anything of that. And so part of the food aid thing is exporting our scientific knowledge to African countries. And so, again, they didn't want to impose the scientific method, right? So it was a generational issue. The elders were like, we don't want to pay any attention to that. We've been farming this way for hundreds of years. This is what we're going to keep doing. Well, they had little cabbages like this. And then they had the scientific side, and they had cabbages like we're used to seeing in our markets. And I thought it was a great example because it was a way that, you know, you don't go in and just mow down somebody's beliefs and traditions, but it was demonstrating, you know, the differences. And so the idea is, and we reformed the food aid. I got a lot of pushback. That the main opposition I got was from Democrats. Democrats who wanted to continue the charity mentality, right, and also Democrats that were fighting to preserve the union jobs. And I said, well, okay, we got to preserve the union jobs, but not at the expense, right, of the Africans. And we can't be destroying these people's local markets. So what we need to do instead of exporting food is export money. And give, you know, and I'm saying this like if there's a disaster or something that happened, don't send food, send money. Help the people in the next country or the area where there isn't a flood or whatever. Help them to export or, you know, or to send the food over to where there is a problem. So we were able to, we battled it last year, lost, but we were able to make some reforms. One of the pushbacks I got was from a CDC member who had a merchant marine school in his community. And merchant marines were where the young African-American kids were getting, you know, were able to get jobs. So we are going to figure out how to keep that going, how they don't get hurt. But on the other hand, we can't keep it, you know, going that way because it actually hurts African communities. And then in terms of what you can do to help, I believe there is a sheet that everybody has that gives you kind of the basic 101 about AGOA. And then it tells you, and you might kind of, please don't blow it off because it just seems so simplistic, but it really is important to call your member of Congress, call the Washington, D.C. office. I mean, they'll tell you, you know, she manages the L.A. office, and they're the ones that get hit with the phone calls. When they get hit with phone calls, don't you think I know this? They call and tell me. 10 people said they're mad because you didn't go see Netanyahu. Or, you know. They get those calls. So if you call up your member of Congress, call the D.C. office, or even if you call, and everybody here has a member of Congress, and if you don't know who your member of Congress is, just Google who is my member of Congress. Something pops up, you put in your area code, your zip code, and it tells you who your member is. Call them and say, we need AGOA reauthorized. And if you get 9 or 10 people, if it's one call, okay, they're not going to call me and tell me one person called. But when it hits 10, 15, I am notified that these calls are coming in. And if there's ministers in the area, organizations in the area, we were able to get AGOA extended the last time because a group of ministers just happened to be meeting with a key senator who was blocking it. And when those ministers walked into his office and said, "You're up for re-election, you have to make this happen," all of a sudden that block went away. So, if you could do that, it would be extremely helpful. We got to get this done. Every day that it's delayed, folks are losing their jobs. Listen, let me just say that it is just an incredible honor to speak before you. The work that you guys are doing, in the universities, the young people here who might be students. You look old, you look like students, but some of you might be young professors. I don't know. But anyway, you're educating our folks, and to me, I don't think that there's anything that you could be doing that is more important, more significant in our community. So I'm honored to have had the opportunity to share some time with you.